Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to put a few slides up, so just bear with me a second. Okay, so welcome to our sixth in the series of FAM webinars. Thank you for joining us. We're going to carry on with our discussions about asbestos limits. And really, FAM has sort of brought this together to try and give you an insight into what changes are happening in the EU. And today we're going to look at two methods, PCM versus TEM, and the UK experience of monitoring asbestos removal workers using TEM. So why are we here? Well, the purpose of this webinar really is, a knowledge-led discussion on the use of TEM for regulatory fibre counting to determine the OEL. Obviously in the UK we use control limit, not OEL, but that's a European slant. But we want to discuss what advantages and disadvantages it could bring to the protection of UK asbestos removal and maintenance workers. So this series was really prompted by the proposed changes to the EU directive for the protection of asbestos workers, which sets out an order of magnitude change to PCM 8-hour exposure limits, the OEL, and that's coming into play by the end of this year. Now, if you wanted to follow up on our previous webinars, we've had 5 already. They're on the YouTube channel, and if you go into the chat box, you'll see them all there as well. So you're welcome to go back and have a look at and listen to some of the previous webinars. So today we've got our two presenters, Gary and James. Gary, you'll know very well, has got 50 years experience of asbestos fibre analysis by light and electron microscopy. And James is here, both members of FAM. James works at Buxton, which many of you will know, the HSC's Science and Research Centre, and his focus is all about TEM. So his daily life is working with those instruments. So James has got a very detailed knowledge and is an established researcher. So we're very lucky to have him today. So thank you, James. So just a bit of background, and again, Gary will go over some of this, but again, just unpacking what the changes to the directive could actually mean for the EU, for all those countries that are going to have to absorb this. The aim is to reduce the 8-hour occupational exposure limit as measured by PCM by a factor of 10 to 0.01. So, and as I said, this is by December 2025. Then there's going to be a further reduction in the overall factor, to 50 to 0.002. So some very small numbers there by 2029. But of course, this is all dependent, as you can see the asterisk there, that countries have got to report back on a feasibility assessment by December 2028 under Article 22 to see whether this is technically feasible to be able to do that. There's also a third part to this, which Gary will go into in more detail, as you can see there, is looking at these thinner fibres, which light microscopy just can't pick up, as we know, and that there's going to be technological advances. Could that be with AI? Could that be with machine learning, so that we can count thinner fibres? And what does that mean? So just by way of, sort of introducing this, a press release back in September 28th in 2022, Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicholas Schmidt, said, "Last year we made a commitment before the European Parliament to address the important calls to action in its report on protecting workers from asbestos. 1 year later, the Commission is presenting a series of measures that will not only provide better protection to workers, but will take a huge step towards an asbestos-free Europe. 78% of occupational cancers recognised in member states are related to asbestos. The amending directive we propose today will drastically reduce exposure levels for workers and provide training and guidance to employers." So that's really what's behind these changes, is the ultimate aim of an asbestos-free Europe. So we've got two points here, that in December 2028, the Commissioner will assess the feasibility of further lowering the limit values of the basis of the member states' report submitted pursuant to Article 22. So this will mean a lot of technical development. Some countries are already introducing TEM and SEM, others are still using PCM. So we're watching carefully as to how this is going to pan out. And then we've got this significant change into looking at what Gary has named electron long fibers, these very thin fibers, but we don't know what the methodology is going to be. So again, we're watching that closely and we'll report back to FAM members. So I'm going to hand over firstly to Gary. Gary's going to present his talk, and then we're going to have any discussion that might come out of that. So please put your answers in the chat box and we will answer those, and then we're going to James's presentation, and then again we'll have another opportunity for discussion should some questions come up. Okay, I shall hand over to Gary. Thank you, Gary.
You know, the title of this webinar is PCM versus TEM and the UK experience. So I'm going to use a more broad brush approach. So it's really an overview and how did we get here? There's no, silver bullet, widely accepted method for asbestos related disease. What causes it? So we use an index of exposure. It's a regulated index of exposure. The PCM method was developed 60 years ago with industry, and it's based on personal sampling on the lapel, which was quite revolutionary to assess what individual workers get exposed to. It really does four things. It's used to, the PCM sampling is used to assess and refine the performance of workplace controls, provide a standard measurement unit for epidemiological studies and therefore for risk assessments, and also we use it for regulatory workplace exposure limits. So it's all pretty bound up, and I will mention that BOHS has sort of got its hands dirty before in this whole area. In 1968, it published a hygiene standard for crystatile asbestos dust, and it was seen as one of the most influential and controversial things BOHS has ever done. So that's a call for arms, in my view. Let's get stuck in. Why not? We've waited 60 years for this, and it is a really big generational discussion and change, and we've got to have a proper debate. Of course, other methods for sampling and regulation are available. In China and Russia, they use static sampling of total gravimetric dust. And in ambient air, we tend to use ISO and TEM analysis because we have to identify the few asbestos fibers that are among the many non-asbestos fibers. So there are other methods available. Does the PCM method work? Well, this is the UK data, and it's a bit easier for me because I'm in my 70s. Where the two top lines cross, the less than 75 rates of mesothelioma have decreased rapidly with a 40-year time lag since 1970. And 1969 was the major watershed as the first, proper, a big difference in how we control asbestos in industry. So the PCM index, and we can argue about this, does seem to work as measuring what people are getting exposed to. Going back to the European directive, I think it was explained very well. So if we look at the last bit, it's changing to a electron microscopy method, which can count long, thin fibers, possibly not counted by PCM. Now, this isn't very defined, so I use the term electron long fibers. per millimetre of air. So that's any fibre greater than 5 micron long of any dimensions. I'll come back to that. So at the conference in May, I discussed this briefly and said there's 4 things I think FAM need to talk about. One is what's the most effective ways of protecting UK asbestos removal and maintenance workers. And exactly a year ago, if you were on the second webinar, we were talking about, where do we really need to sample? So really that is recapping that a little bit, but it's not just about how much lower the OEL should be. That's not going to protect a worker very well if you never measure it. To determine and evaluate what additional benefits would be achieved by measuring the workplace exposure by EM, and from the UK's point of view and everybody else's, what's the practical steps and difficulties to convert from PCM to TEM? And finally, what I'd like to look at, and James is going to do this as well, is why is there a factor of 5 built in to the European directive for the EM PCM control limits? Okay, so I'm going to try and answer those rather than talk in the very minutiae about the differences between PCM and TEM. So the most effective ways of protecting workers is the use of effective controls at source and monitoring that those controls are effective. And that could involve real-time monitoring, continuous monitoring, and then adjusting the controls, etc., etc. And finally, using PCM or EM analysis to determine whether all your adjustments you comply. In the UK, RPE has traditionally been used, respiratory protection, as an insurance or backup, not as a primary control as it is in some European countries. There is, of course, a big commercial tension, the speed and cost and the profit of the removal for the, independent business doing it versus maintaining a license and the insurance costs. But at the present time, if we're talking about the OEL or control limit being an effective measure of controlling exposure, I estimate there's about 1 sample per removal worker in the licensed asbestos removal industry per year on average, 1 sample per year. That's a 0.25% sample of their work time. Now, each work site is going to be different and it changes. So it's not like an industry where you were doing the same process. There's, massive differences in materials and the environment. So moving on, the second bit, what's the advantages of TEM over PCM? There are there's some really big advantages. You can use the same filter as for the PCM. It's a direct sample preparation, so it looks at the same field of view or the same things as what the PCM does. It has higher magnification and better, visibility, so you can see thinner fibers. You can count and even size the fibers because of the higher magnifications, and you've got identification capabilities if you need them. The other thing is there's a single plane of focus, so that saves racking through everything. Disadvantages, it's off-site analysis, longer preparation and analytical times. You're not going to get them on site. You have to wait for the results, and often the job will have finished before you get those results. So it's not an effective feedback mechanism on site to help those workers have lower exposure. It's much more expensive, and it's going to use different measurement indices if thin fibers are counted. Although there are well-established methods, it's unclear what the EU method will be. And there's going to be less measurements even than a 0.25%. because of cost. I'm going to show you this picture, which was taken 40 years ago using darkroom techniques and 35mm film and TEM plates. But this demonstrates on the left is the PCM field of view, and on the right is the TEM field of view at roughly, they're both the same scale, 100 microns, which is the sort of field of view that you get on a PCM graticule. And as you can see, the TEM is much more well defined, and you can see more fibers. But I'm only looking at one field of view, one plane of view on the left-hand side. And if I rack through it, I would see a lot more of the fibers and detail. But the really important thing about this is that it's an example of, to make up this solution, it's just shaken in water. All I did was use a tiny little tweezerful of chrysotile and put it in the water and shake it. Now, that's what you do when you do an indirect analysis as well. So instead of just looking at what's on the filter, you ash the filter and shake it up in water. And if you've got one little agglomerate of asbestos, it will break up and give you many fibers. Now, the problem with the EU directive and how it can be implemented, it's not very specific. It's not specific on the type of electron microscopy, TEM, STEM, SEM. It's not specific on the emission source. There's no mention of the sample preparation method or the magnification, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. Not specific on the minimum fiber width that must be resolved. And it's not specific on whether we just count all fibers like the PCM does, or analyze and identify for asbestos fibers only. So it's also not specific on whether how we do the human counting, or do we move to AI counting. So at the end of the day, we have yet to agree a method. Now, the directive already allows you to use any method you want, providing you can show equivalence to PCM. So, there's a lot to know. And that's why I use electron long fibers, because I don't know what we're measuring yet or how. Can we move towards EM? Is it practical in the UK? EMs are usually large instruments based in laboratories with dedicated facilities and personnel. More recently, you have compact desktop TEMs, SEMs, and STEMs, and that will increase the availability and to some extent the portability, but they're unlikely to be viable to take out on site. It's just not viable at the present time. The type of emission source and the type of EM is incredibly important to what thin fibers you will see. And the initial costs and maintenance are really high. So you can't upgrade the PCM lab to electron microscopy in the current commercial environment. That's my view. It's just, especially when it's unspecified, you don't even know whether you should buy a TEM, an SEM, a STEM, or what. So the final thing, the factor of 5 is really important. Here's some measurements taken at an amosite and chrysotile board removal in 1980. The top two lines are the TEM measurements, and I've just joined up, their PCM and TEM results, and I've joined them up to look and see if there's any correspondence or standard ratio between them. The two top lines are all fibers, including inorganic fibers by TEM greater than 5, and all asbestos fibers. So what you can see was nearly all the fibers we saw were asbestos by TEM. The PCM has factors of 2 or so lower, average of 2 lower, I would say. And the reason for that is that we had different counting rules in those days. if I counted the same thing by TEM, yeah, and these were for direct analysis, I could count 10 fibers by one structure by TEM and 0 fibers by PCM, because we didn't account, we wouldn't count fibers attached to particles bigger than 3 microns, and etc., etc. So these are probably the worst case. So finally, is there a way forward? So instead of PCM versus TEM, I think we could have PCM plus TEM. You only count 1/500th of a filter by the PCM analysis. So we can easily cut it in half and have loads for counting. We analyze the half filter on site by PCM, feed back the results to the licensed asbestos removal contractor. And, if it's under control, fine. If it's not, you need to improve controls and look at the method statement, make the changes, and there's the guy still on site. You can resample so we can protect workers. If after your changes it remains high, perhaps we should go to higher performance respiratory protection. If you can't control it, you need better respiratory protection. And then after we've done that, we can actually work out what the estimated personal exposure is, which is the PCM result, the initial one or the one after changing, over the protection factor of the RPE. And what I'm saying is we can comply if we do that with the directive. The new changes in the directive is that if the estimated personal exposure is greater than 0.002 fibers per ml, you can say, well, that we've broken the OEL if we wanted to. If you can't get things sorted, send the other half filter for TEM analysis, and you can sort it, see what exposure they got. As 85% of UK notified removals involve amosite, I think these can be readily assessed by PCM. So this is where I hand over to James Staff. And if there's any questions for clarification, now's your chance. Sorry, I didn't have my volume up high enough, maybe. Yeah, no, it's right up. Yeah, okay. Those ones?
That's the one, and then the 2 pictures, that's it, that one there. Do you want to briefly just go over that again?
Yeah,
thank you.
This is a picture I took, pictures of a direct sample preparation method, just to show this using the finest chrysotile, textile grade chrysotile, where we shook it up with water and just filtered it, and then took a PCM picture on the left, and then prepared the filter for TEM analysis. So you're looking at exactly the same field. And this is to demonstrate the straightforward, how much better the TEM image is than the PCM image. I'm not saying the PCM is perfect by any means, and the TEM is, the gold standard method for getting really, maybe fake SEM could do it, but this is the way you can see every fiber if you're interested in every thin fiber. And I did make the point that this filter that I prepared was made up by putting a single little, agglomerate of chrysotile and shaking it up in water. So that gave me the filter which I directly prepared. But if I had that little agglomerate on a slide on the filter, and then went through an indirect preparation, I would get a lot more fibers in an indirect preparation, and that becomes more important when we look at where the value of 5 for the thin fibers comes into the European directive. Is that enough explanation?
Thank you, Gary. Yes, and if you don't mind bringing up the graph as well.
Okay. This was some old data that went out on site in 1980, and this was removal of amosite and chrysotile board, and the top line is the TEM results. That there's two there. One is all fibers of any type greater than 5, and the other one is asbestos fibers. So there were virtually no non-asbestos fibers in the samples, and the PCM result is the blue line below. And I just joined them all up to see if there was any correspondence or coordination. But you can see there's about a factor of 2 difference in the TEM result to the PCM result. But this was partly due to the difference in counting rules. So that's why James's presentation, looking at the modern counting rules that we used for PCM, the WHO 1997 rules, where we do count fibers by PCM attached particles greater than 3 microns. And there are some other subtle differences. Okay.
Thank you, Gary. That's great. I'm just looking at the chat. There's nothing. We're just saying, would you mind sharing those 2 graphs separately outside of the webinar, Gary? I'm sure we can make those available if you're happy to do that.
Oh yeah. I mean, they'll be on the webinar anyway, recorded. Yeah. But they're published in a paper. So if I could remember which one in the an American journal.
Yeah, great. So we could share that. That's not a problem after the webinar. There's also Alan Graham came back with, sort of if we did go to electron microscopy, particularly TEM, will it be an issue, particularly for training people? Well, we don't actually have any commercial availability for TEM in the UK, do we? Maybe James could help me out there.
Brunel, I think, offer it.
HC.
Yeah, so
we'll do commercial analysis.
There you go. So we've got 2 potential, sort of avenues for commercial analysis. But but I guess training is very involved, and also investment in the technology is extremely expensive. And James, I know you'll carry on. Richard Brown, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in now?
Yeah, just a question on obviously the new limits are in EU only. Maybe the UK will follow on. Measurement in itself is not a control measure, and yet we're setting standards that are an order of magnitude plus greater. Do we have improved control measures that will enable us to meet those new limits? I mean, I'm all for it, because obviously asbestos is a carcinogen. It doesn't have a true no effect level. But there's no point setting a limit and measuring it if you can't actually control to it. So do we have the technology to provide control down at that level?
Can I answer that one very briefly? It depends. It's a challenge, and yes, we must have the methods, and that's what I talked about at the beginning. You've got to have the controls at source to do it. To give you an example, what's happening in Europe, if you look at the French study, which they published in 2018, they looked at 71 sites, and they measured the asbestos using TEM, and then they divided it, the estimated personal exposure by the respiratory protection, So they divided it, I think it was 60 in France, and over half the sites were above 0.1 fiber per ml that they visited. So they don't have the control. If you want to lower the control limit, the sites they were visiting, over half of them, even with the respirators on, they weren't below the control limit. So I think I'm right on that. So you make a very valid point.
Okay. Oh, Martin, do you want to quickly come in, and then we'll carry on with James? Hello, Martin.
Just quickly, I'm not directly familiar with that study, but I think I suspect that's partly to do with failure of controls, because I think very modern standards of asbestos removal controls properly adhered to and properly followed, I think can achieve extremely low levels of exposure with good RPE as a backup. I think a lot of the issues is that's not necessarily always achieved.
Thank you, Martin. And I think, Gary, have you got anything to add to that, or shall we just move on to James? Okay, so thank you, Gary, and thank you for all the questions so far. I'm going to hand you over to James now, and he's going to introduce a study, some research data that will be interesting. Thank you, James.
Right. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay,
although
great.
if you can expand it so we can see the slide, that'd be great.
There you go. Everybody see
Perfect.
that? Okay. Perfect. Right. Let me just move that over there. Right. Hi everybody. I'm James Staff from HC's Science and Research Centre in Buxton. I'll just start off by saying here, lots of you will have already seen these results presented at the FAM Asbestos Conference in May. There's no new results to add to it here, but I'll go through it again for anybody who missed it first time round. And for the rest of you, hopefully this will freshen it a little bit in your minds. Okay, so the data here come from an HC project which looked at the British licensed asbestos removal industry. HC scientists visited 8 different licensed asbestos removal sites over a period of 3.5 years from May 2016 to November 2019. A variety of different samples and data were collected on these visits, and 3 different HC research reports have been published as a result. These are all available for free on the HC website if you're interested to read more. So on the left here, you can see a brief summary of the material which was being removed on each of these 8 site visits. On the right is a breakdown of the license removal notifications which were received by HSE last year. So you can see the site visits were dominated by removals of asbestos insulation board, or AIB, with 5 of the visits related to that. 2 visits related to asbestos insulation and the other 2 sprayed coating. If you compare that to the graph on the right, where you can see there's 74% of the notifications were for AIB, 21% for asbestos insulation, and a small amount, 2% for spray coating, you get an idea that the removals observed during the study were quite a fair representation of what we see in real life. So thinking about the asbestos types we'd expect to see, AIB primarily contains amosite, sometimes with a smaller amount of chrysotile as well. The spray coating in the 6th visit was also amosite, though crucidolite is also common in spray coatings. So overall, we expected to see predominantly amosite in these samples. Ooh. So at each site, both static and personal air sampling were carried out. The HC scientists were on site from the start of the enclosure construction all the way through the job to the completion of dismantling the enclosure, and sampling was carried out regularly at times across this period. Samples were taken in multiple locations, both inside and outside of the enclosure. Each filter was halved, and PCM analysis was carried out on site. For a subset of these, the remaining half filter was also sent back to Buxton, where it was also analysed by TEM. We prepared the samples for TEM using a direct sample preparation method, and that was based on ISO 10312. So for the TEM analysis, we counted PCM equivalent or PCME fibres to make the data as comparable as possible with PCM analysis. So these are fibres with the same dimensions you would expect to see during a PCM analysis. That is a length greater than 5 microns, a width between 0.2 and 3 microns, and an aspect ratio greater than 3:1. We used two additional techniques, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or EDX, and selected area electron diffraction, or SAED, on the TEM to allow us to differentiate between asbestos and non-asbestos fibres and between the different asbestos types. So as I mentioned before, from the materials being removed, we expected to see a lot of amosite in these site visits, and that was very much the case. Of just over 1,000 asbestos fibres identified during the study, 98.1% of these were amosite. If we look at the dimensions of the fibres, we saw smaller fibres much more frequently than larger fibres, as you might expect, and the frequency decreased consistently as both the length and the width increased. So to set it out a little bit more clearly and look at each dimension independently, we need to remember that for the length, we didn't count any fibres below 5 microns in length. So you can see the frequency continues to increase right down to that 5 micron limit. For fibre width, however, we see a peak in the frequency between 0.3 and 0.4 microns. And because of the limitations with the PCME method in looking at this, we then analysed a further 121 amosite fibres from the most heavily loaded sample, just to take a closer look. This time we counted all asbestos fibres. So looking at the width, we again see a similar result. The peak in the frequency was between 0.3 and 0.4 microns. Only 12.4% of the amosite fibres seen were thinner than 0.2 microns. So we'd expect to be able to see the vast majority of these fibres on a PCM microscope. Looking at the length, the most common fibre length was between 2 and 3 microns. So 58% of the amosite fibres we saw were below 5 microns in length, and so those wouldn't be included in a PCM count. And here are those data for the 121 amosite fibres presented in that three-dimensional graph format again. It's important to note here that this is just for amosite really, and also just in a single material. These distributions will vary a lot for different asbestos types, especially for chrysotile, which would be very different because it has very thin fibres. They would also vary to some degree for the same asbestos type, depending on how the material had been processed, what material it was in, or how it had been disturbed in order for the fibres to become airborne. So moving on to the results of the study, we analysed 113 individual samples by both PCM and TEM. Of these, 71 had PCM results below the limit of detection and 60 had TEM results below the limit of detection. So we therefore ended up with 29 samples where we had a quantifiable result for both PCM and TEM. So those are the ones that we looked at in more detail. So if we plot those 29 pairs of results with the TEM concentration versus the PCM concentration, we see quite a good correlation with a TEM to PCM ratio of 1.45. But as you can see from the chart, there were 3 quite high data points which stood out, and the trend line is quite heavily influenced by those. So we had a look at the remaining data with those 3 high data points excluded. We saw now that the relationship was a lot weaker and that the TEM to PCM ratio was different, now 0.67. There could be a good reason for this. At these low levels, the data can be much more influenced by factors such as non-asbestos fibres being picked up and counted by PCM. However, those samples were not all taken from removal operatives inside the enclosure. They were taken around the site at different times and different locations. So to bring it back, just to think about removal operatives, we can narrow it down to just personal samples from operatives taken inside the enclosure during removal. And that turns out to be 10 of those 29 samples. So if we plot that graph again with just these 10 data points, we see a very good correlation again, and a TEM to PCM ratio which is similar at 1.5. And now if we remove the 3 high data points again and look at the remaining data, there's a much better correlation this time. We'd expect this because the samples are more similar and taken from doing the same activity. And we now see a TEM to PCM ratio of 1.02. So to summarise, the data from this study suggested an overall TEM to PCM ratio, certainly for higher amounts of asbestos, of 1.3 to 1.5. And it's important to remember that that's in predominantly amosite-containing materials. At very low fibre concentrations, the correlation is a little weaker, and the TEM to PCM ratio is also lower. The relationship remained quite similar whether we considered all the samples taken from the study or just the personal samples taken from the operatives during the removal. As I said, it's really important to note that these data only relate to predominantly amosite-containing materials, and also to TEM analysis with direct sample preparation. These relationships could be altered by many other factors: the type of asbestos, the presence of non-asbestos fibres or not, using SEM or TEM, direct or indirect sample preparation, amongst many other things. There was work done on this by Perosh and presented by Remy Franken at an early stage at the FAM Asbestos Conference in 2022. This collected data from several of the participating Perosh countries and looked for trends. The work found that the EM to PCM ratio was not constant, but changed significantly between different data sets. And that's likely due to combinations of all these factors I've talked about. This work was recently published as a paper in the Annals of Work Exposures and Health. The name of that paper is there on the slide, and I'd recommend having a look at that if this is an area you're interested to learn more about. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. I think everyone will agree that was a really interesting study. If you want to know more, you can go back to the webinar later, or if you're a member of FAM, you would have had access to the FAM conference where James explained in a little bit more detail the research. But I think we got a good impression of where does PCM and TEM sit together in terms of measuring exposure on site. So really interesting. Thank you, James. And if anyone had been to visit Buxton last year and had a look at TEM, you can see how complex the process is, as well as SEM. Very complex, very different to PCM. So we're going to take any questions. If you want to pose questions, either raise your hand. I'm happy to take them live, or if you want to put them in the chat. We've got one question that maybe Gary or James could answer, and this is from Mark Bartlett. Is the answer not just to improve APF, the assigned protection factor of RPE? I'm sure lots of people have an opinion on that, but Gary or James?
Well, very quickly, the site protection factor of, we did have, I think maybe our last web conference was on this, so I won't, I mean, ideally, yes, but if you've got air hoses and things like that, you get really other big safety issues. So, this is something that needs sorting out, and we have done a webinar on it already.
Yeah, it was webinar number 4 in the series, which I put in the chat box further up. So if you want to follow up on that or go to the BOHS YouTube channel, then please, you can look at that webinar. Again, worth spending some time having a look at it. Martin, would you like to come in again? Sorry, you're on mute, Martin.
Just a query about SEM, because I know TM is better than SEM, but you've not. Is the directive just talks about electron microscopy? Does it talk specifically about TM? Are we disregarding SEM of being any particular of value?
I could take that one. No, I think SEM is certainly of value. Analytically, it's not quite as good as TEM, but it's certainly more than capable. And I think in Europe, a lot of the countries that are sort of now sort of adapting their processes are thinking more probably about SEM than TEM. France is very heavily invested in TEM, but there's several countries are already using SEM and have been using SEM for quite a long time now. The advantage that TEM can offer, if you're wanting to directly compare the two methods, or to have electron microscopy as a sort of second step, as Gary suggested, is that you can use the same air filters. So the MTE air filter that you already use for PCM, you can also analyze that by TEM, whereas you can't really take an MCE filter and prepare that for an SEM analysis. You need to use a polycarbonate filter for that.
James, can I just cut you short? The next webinar we hope is going to be SEM versus PCM. So come to that. We haven't quite got it organized, but that's the next webinar. So okay. PCM versus TEM, this one.
Right, okay, fair enough. Can I just ask you, Sarah, a quick follow-up question? And we're only talking about use of electron microscopy for personal sampling air testing, not beyond personal sampling.
Gary, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, well, the directive is the workplace, asbestos workplace levels. Of course, there's all sorts of knock-on effects, but let's just stick to the directive first.
Okay.
That's webinar 11, 12, and 13, Martin. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this directive, and we're only just at the beginning. Thank you, Martin. There's a question from Gabrielle. Are there any advances on automated counting using SEM and TEM? I'm sure, James, you can answer that one.
I think it's something that a lot of people are working on. I know of a few sort of examples. I know in France there's a lab where I believe they've got accredited for an automated TEM counting method. However, that is, as far as I know, currently just on one individual microscope, and they've spent about 2 years sort of collating training data to do this. And I think the accreditation wouldn't be valid if they then used a different microscope. So to use a different microscope, let alone in a different laboratory, they would then have to collect an entirely new set of training data as it stands. So that's not, whilst it's a proof of concept, it's not something that could just be rolled out on a wider scale. I know of lots of people working on developing automated SEM. I know Oxford Instruments, I believe, have got some automated SEM EDX software, which I'm actually going to have a demonstration of next week, so I'll know a bit more about it after that. I think there's basically I don't think there's anybody really using it on a wide scale yet. But I think it's something that lots of people are thinking about and lots of people are working on.
Can I just mention, for historical information, there used to be an automated PCM method called Magiscan that was used as the basis. But there's massive amount of money, European research money, going into SEM AI. That's the big flavour of the month.
Thank you. I've got 2 more questions here, and then we'll move on. Dawn has posed a question: would you see this having an impact on other fibres in terms of analysis, other than asbestos, I guess? James, you're an expert in RCF fibres as well. Would TEM be very useful with looking at other occupational hazards in terms of fibre?
I mean, electron microscopy, SEM or TEM, is really useful because you've got that extra analytical capability, so you can identify what it is you're seeing and sort of find the chemistry of the fibres. So I mean, that's useful not just for asbestos, for things like RCF, identifying different types of sort of man-made mineral fibres and refractory ceramic fibres, that type of thing. So that capability is useful for identifying those as well. And that's something that you don't have on PCM. So I think that capability is useful.
Excellent. I'm just going to ask you quickly. Andy has posed a question here. How do these proposed OELs compare with incidental asbestos exposure to the general public in the wider environment? Is the UK wildly different to other countries? That's a big one to unpack. Thanks for that, Andy. Who's gonna try that one? Gary, maybe?
Well, the OEL is 0.1 across Europe at the moment, although it's going to change and fall. The wider environment, we know quite a lot about. The problem is, PCM has its limitations because there's plenty of other types of fibers there. So that's why we have ISO methods for TEM and SEM analysis in ambient air. So it's horses for courses. We don't have an environmental level as such set in this country. Some countries do set environmental levels. So it's I'm sure we'll have more webinars on this. I've got this feeling,
And just something I've picked up recently, looking at whether we in the UK should change the narrative in terms of how we're expressing concentration from fibres per mil. Should we look at fibres per metre cubed as a number? As we're reducing to these very low numbers, is there a benefit to the public knowledge, really, of expressing them in a different way? Gary?
Maybe not. I mean, it's normally, the types of, measurements you're getting now are, around the control limit, 0.1, some of them could be 1, some of them did go down to 0.01. That seems to be generally you want the number like 1 in the sort of middle of the range. So if we're 1,000 lower, fibers per litre would make sense. But if you're talking about 100 fibers per litre or 1,000 fibers per litre, that's the same argument other way. So I think stick with fibers per ml at the moment because, I think people understand it, but, it's only a unit, but I'm sure people can get very upset about it.
Oh, I'm sure there's a lot more to unpack on there. So, but thank you. I think I'm going to get Lee to come in with the VVOX challenge for you all to answer one question while we just roll on towards the end of the hour. We've got another 4 minutes. So, Lee, if you don't mind posing the VVOX question and explain what we need to do. Thank you.
Yeah, I can do. So I will just share my screen here. If I just present full screen and start the session. So some of you may have used this in the past. So if you've just got your phone to hand, if you type in vvox.app just into the browser there, and when prompted, just put in that 9-digit code. If I open it here, I can see that a few people were really on it and straight away. So as you can see, this is the question here. Do you consider that continuing with membrane filter sampling with PCM analysis for assessing workplace control and protecting UK removal workers is? And then if you just put your answer in there, I'll give you a minute and then I will leave the question open while we continue with the rest of the webinar, and then we'll come back to this to have a look at the answers before we say goodbye. So
thank you, Lee.
People are joining in. Yep. So I'll stop sharing now. So I'll put these details into the chat just in case you do miss it, the address and the code there, but I'll keep it open until we're done.
Okay, thank you. So I can carry on with my presentation, yeah?
Yep. So I'll just stop sharing, but I'll put the details into the chat now.
Thank you. So just as we're starting to finish, if I can get that up. Okay, so we'll have the VVox question, and we'll look at the answers for that. But as a way of sort of wrapping up today, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to James and Gary for setting out and posing the questions and looking at TEM versus PCM. Still a long way to go, but it's a great idea to have these webinars so that we can open up a discussion, and thank you for all your questions that you've posed today. So just looking ahead, if you're interested in finding out more, and our science-led conference in April next year, it'll be in Birmingham, and it's for 2 days, 29th and 30th of April. So please look out for promotion of that, and there'll be an early bird ticket arrangement again. It's well worth coming to, and it's something that we really enjoy each year. Also, I recommend looking out for the FAM newsletters that come through via email. We're going to look at attaching them to the website so you can find and pick them up again. But I thoroughly recommend, a lot of work goes into these newsletters, and there's some really unique articles. So I thoroughly recommend that you have a look at them when they land in your inbox. I know with my email, it's never easy to find these things again, but we're trying to rectify that. So just lastly, a plug for the 7th FAM webinar in November. Got to secure a date yet, but we're going to look at SEM versus PCM. In the similar vein that we've done today with TEM, we're going to follow up some details, and we'll come back to that. So thank you very much for being with us today. We're just coming up to the hour, and I was just wondering, Lee, have we got any response on the VVox?
Yep, so I'll just share my screen again, if that's okay. We can just have a quick look at the results there. So can you see, I'm just going to close the poll so we can see the answers come in. So there you go. Can you see the results there? Yep, can you see those, Sarah, at all?
Yeah, we can see those.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's good. Interesting. Yeah.
It seems to have frozen there, sorry. I'll just reshare the screen here. Didn't realise. There you go, yeah. So I don't know if you want me to keep that up, if there's anything to say on the back of what's come through.
I think Sarah's possibly frozen. So I guess we might just need to say thank you to everybody for attending. And it's 12 o'clock, so I guess that's just about the end of things. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yep, and this is being recorded, so it'll be up on the BHS YouTube channel either this afternoon or first thing tomorrow. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.